Young George. George Walker Bush was born in New Haven, Connecticut, on July 6, 1946. He was the first of Barbara and George H.W. of Bush's 6 children. His sister Robin was born next. Jeb, Neil, Marvin, and Dorothy followed. In 1948, George's family moved to Odessa, Texas. There, his father worked for an oil company. 2 years later, the Bush family settled into a little blue house in Midland, Texas. George spent his childhood in Midland. There, he played with the children in his neighborhood. They liked to ride their bicycles and play marbles and basketball. Later, George attended San Jacinto Junior High School in Midland. He was an average student. Yet, he was elected class president. He also played quarterback on San Jacinto's football school days. Meanwhile, George's father traveled much for work. Eventually, his company began drilling for oil in Che Gulf of Mexico. So, he moved his business to be near the Gulf. In 1959, the Bushes settled in Houston, Texas. George transferred to a private school there called the Kincaid School. George's parents wanted him to have the best education possible. So in 1961, they sent him to Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. George missed his family and struggled with his lessons. He feared he might fail. However, George decided to try his best. He stayed up late studying. He also made many new friends. George played on the baseball and basketball teams. And he became the head football cheerleader his senior year. In 1964, George graduated from Phillips Academy. That fall, he entered Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. At Yale, George studied history. He also played basketball and rugby. In addition, George loved to be social. So, he joined a fraternity and was elected its president. Flight School. Bush graduated from Yale in 1968. He then joined the Texas Air National Guard. In July, he entered as a second lieutenant. Bush went to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. There, he participated in basic training. That November, Bush entered flight school at Moody Air Force Base in Valdosta, Georgia. He graduated in 1969. His father gave a speech at the graduation ceremony. In December, Bush left for Ellington Air Force Base in Houston. There, he learned to fly F-102 fighter airplanes. On June 23, Bush finished his combat flight training. He graduated with the rank of lieutenant. After graduation, Bush continued flying for the Texas Air National Guard part-time. He also had several other jobs. First, he worked for an agricultural company. Then, he worked on Alabama Republican William Blount's campaign for U.S. Senate. He also got a job working with poor children in Tucson. Bush eventually decided to return to school. On October 1, 1973, he was honorably discharged from the Texas Air National Guard. He then entered Harvard Business School in Boston, Massachusetts. Business and Politics. In 1975, Bush graduated from Harvard Business School. He wanted to work in Tok Od bust fitching his father. So, he hitched to his childhood home of Midland, Texas. There, Bush worked as a landman. He looked up Lynn Titler at the county Titai showed him W.H.C. Cranestrand. Then, Bush contacted the landowner. He asked them if oil companies could rent the land to drill for oil. In 1977, Bush started his own oil candidate Arbusto Energy. That same year, Bush met school librarian Laura Lane Welsh. On November S, the couple married. 4 years later, the Bushes welcomed twin girls. They named their daughters Jenna and Barbara. Meanwhile, Bush had decided to enter politics. In 1978, he campaigned for a scat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Bush ran as a Republican. His opponent was Democrat Kent Hance. Hance claimed Bush was an outsider. He reminded Texan voters that Bush had been born and educated outside of Texas. So, Bush lost the election. After his defeat, Bush returned to Opus Energy. He raised money from investors to build his business. In 1982, Bush changed the company's name to Bush Exploration. By this time, the oil industry was in trouble. Oil prices were dropping, and Bush Exploration was losing money. So in 1984, Bush sold his company to Spectrum Corporation. Meanwhile, the oil industry continued to struggle. Bush knew Spectrum needed help. In 1986, the Harken Oil and Gas Company agreed to buy Spectrum. Bush took a job at Harken as a consultant. He also served on the board of directors. In 1988, Bush's father ran for president. Bush helped with the campaign. He worked as an advisor and a speechwriter. Bush's father easily won the election. That same year, Bush learned that the Texas Rangers baseball team was for sale. He together in Bo Glinton team in 1989. Bush enjoyed Baynor team own it. As managing general partner, he promoted the Rangers. Bush also worked to increase attendance at games. Soon, he won support to build a new basketball stadium for the team. Governor Bush. Bush focused on his work, but he was still interested in politics. So in 1994, he ran for governor of Texas. His opponent was Governor Rick Hance. The campaign was difficult. Richard Steinmed Bush was unqualified for the job. However, Bush focused on what he thought was best for Texas. He promised to lower crime rates and increase spending on education. He also pledged to reform the welfare system. Texans liked Bush's ideas. That year, he won the election. As governor, Bush improved public education and increased teacher salaries. He made sure people in the welfare system fulfilled work requirements. Governor Bush supported laws for tougher punishment of juvenile criminals. He also reduced property taxes. Bush ran for re-election in 1998. His opponent was Texas Land Commissioner Gary Morrow. Texans still liked Bush. He had kept many of his campaign promises during his first term. So, he won the election in a landslide. Governor Bush's work made him nationally known. So in August 2000, the Republican Party chose him to run for president. Bush chose former Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney as his running mate. The Democratic Party nominated Vice President Al Gore. Gore's running mate was Connecticut Senator Joseph Lieberman. The 2000 election. During his campaign for president, Bush traveled across the country. He promised Americans he would inform education, America close-up collections. To win, a candidate needed to earn at least 270 electoral college votes. But at the end of the night, Harris rose badge to headed on the mass 25 electoral votes would become president. Yet, Florida's results remained too close to call. There, Bush had beaten Gore by only the recount showed Bush was still in the lead. Gore wanted some of the ballots recounted by hand. Florida permitted the recount. But Bush filed this was unfair. So, B filed lawsuits in state and federal courts. Bush lost these lawsuits, so he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court made its final decision on December 12. It stopped all banned recounts in Florida. As a result, Florida's electoral votes were awarded to Bush. This was the only election decided by the Supreme Court. Gore had won more popular votes nationwide. But now Bush had 271 electoral votes to Gore's 266. On December 13, Gore conceded the decision to Bush. Determined leader. On January 20, 2001, Bush was inaugurated the 43rd U.S. president. Immediately, he began working hard for American. Bush soon faced a challenge unlike any other. On September ste, the not any on a triana en Eisthind Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. These acts caused much damage and killed about 3,000 people. Bush vowed that fighting terrorism would be his top priority as president. That night he said, "None of us will ever forget this day. Yet, we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world." The United States quickly learned that Al-Qaeda was behind the attacks. The group was located in Afghanistan. In leader was a terrorist named Osama bin Laden. President Bush spoke with Afghanistan's government, the Taliban. He asked the Taliban to turn over bin Laden and shut down Al-Qaeda. But the Taliban refused. So on October 7, Bush ordered military attacks on Afghanistan. After 11 weeks of war, the Taliban was defeated. However, bin Laden was not captured during the conflict. Meanwhile, President Bush worked hard to improve the lives of Americans at home. In October 2001, he created the Department of Homeland Security. It became responsible for protecting the United States from further attacks. That same month, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. This law helped agencies such as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The act gave FBI agents more freedom to search for suspected terrorists. Bush also worked to reform education and health care. In 2002, he approved the No Child Left Behind Act. It encouraged schools to help students improve their test scores. The next year, Bush signed the Medicare Act of 2003. For the first time, elderly Americans would get help paying for medication. Then in March 2003, the Iraq War began. Bush believed Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was a threat to America's security, so the United States launched an attack on Iraq. Most Americans supported Bush's decision to invade Iraq. Soon, the Iraqi government fell. In May, President Bush declared that major combat operations there had ended. However, U.S. troops remained in Iraq to help the new government maintain control. Soon, the U.S. government's debt grew from paying for the war. By 2004, many Americans no longer believed the war was a good idea. Tough times. As the war continued, President Bush and Vice President Cheney faced re-election. In 2004, the Democrats nominated Massachusetts Senator John Kerry for president. His running mate was North Carolina Senator John Edwards. The campaign was long and difficult. On election day, more than 115 million Americans voted. It was the highest voter turnout since 1968. Bush defeated Kerry by only a small lead. Bush garnered 286 electoral votes to Kerry's 252 votes. President Bush began his second term on January 20, 2005. That August, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. About 1,800 people died because of the storm. The hurricane left thousands homeless. Bush sent aid to the region. But many people were upset because rescue operations were delayed. In 2007, the Iraq War was still raging. Bush wanted to send more troops to Iraq. But Congress disagreed. Instead, Congress passed a bill requiring Bush to begin withdrawing troops. On May 1, Bush vetoed the bill. He believed withdrawing troops would put all the military's hard work at risk. Meanwhile, the economy was in trouble. By late 2007, many people had lost their jobs. The cost of living was increasing. At the same time, home values were falling. Some people could no longer afford their house payments, so in February 2008, President Bush approved an economic stimulus package. It returned some money to taxpayers and businesses. By spending this money, Americans could help boost the economy. That March marked the 5th anniversary of the start of the Iraq War. Leaders hoped the nation would soon be able to stand on its own. Bush left the White House in January 2009. Plans for the George W. Bush Presidential Center are in progress. The center will be located at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. George W. Bush faced many challenges as president. He fought terrorism at home and in foreign lands. He also struggled to improve a slowing economy. Many Americans questioned Bush's decisions. But the Al Wars did what he believed was best for the nation.